Okay, so good afternoon. Take a moment to welcome everybody to CBY620, Compliance and Legal Issues, Cybersecurity. First module, really going through the first three chapters of the textbook and looking at some of the basic functions of information security, a little bit about privacy as it relates to some of the roles and responsibilities within the field of cybersecurity, and then real quick touch on some basic legal systems that we find here in the United States. I'll try to put out a PowerPoint or some sort of presentation for each module prior to it opening, or as close to the opening as I can. And of course, feel free to ask any questions or post anything in the discussion module about the presentation as well. Free exchange of information is always a wonderful way of having or learning about some information that we maybe not be familiar with, or maybe read in the text or some of the other sources, and not just not have a clear understanding of it. So we'll get to it. About 35 slides, so we'll try to power through this and touch on some of the highlights of it, and hopefully there'll be enough there to spear some good conversation. So, part of the first chapter and part of the first module is really try to give some introduction and try to give some common understanding of some of the fundamental concepts of information system security or cybersecurity. And I think that as you move into the discussion module, you're going to see that one of the most important aspects or concepts of cybersecurity is the CIA triad, or confidentiality, integrity, and availability, and how those relate to really everything that we're going to talk about in this course and throughout the program. And we try to understand how they relate to each other, how sometimes they can work against each other, and some of the struggles that we have within the field to try to ensure that we have addressed all of those, all three of those security concerns when we make decisions. We want to make sure that we understand and have a good understanding of some of the basic security concepts. Talk about risk analysis and mitigation, and how we use things like risk analysis, risk assessment, and metrics to help us make some informed decisions in the field of cybersecurity, particularly around strategies that we might want to employ to protect information that the organization might have. And then we'll real quick touch on data classifications, and we'll get into that a little bit more. As I mentioned, confidentiality, integrity, and availability, frequently referred to as the CIA triad, are really the three fundamental concepts that we try to address with our controls and our policies and our practices that we have within the field of cybersecurity in relationship to any organization that you might be working with or for. And I mentioned ever so briefly that sometimes they work against each other. For instance, we can use a tool like encryption to make and ensure that our data is 100% confidential, in that if it's encrypted, it cannot be read by those that do not have access to it, or do not have the decryption key. They can't read it. But that 100% confidentiality makes it absolutely 100% unavailable to those that do not possess the key. So sometimes they can work against each other. And it's said that a system or data is not secure unless we can ensure confidentiality, integrity, and availability of that particular piece of data or that system. So you can see that there's going to be some conflicts that we have to iron out as we look at how do we go about ensuring certain levels of confidentiality, availability, and integrity. Some of the concerns that we have to focus on in the field are things like shoulder surfing, these non-technical attacks, social engineering, trickery, and deceit, and then these others that you've probably heard about, like spear phishing and malware and spyware and logic bombs and these backdoors and denials of service and all these malicious software attacks that we hear about on a daily basis. again, all things that we should be concerned about, but not the only thing that we're concerned about. And that's important to understand, that we're also concerned about errors and omissions and misuse through making uninformed or unintelligent decisions by our legitimate users, our insiders that make mistakes and make errors in judgment, and then sometimes also causes harm deliberately. So if we look at some data classification schemes, and this is kind of important when we begin to look at regulations and we begin to look at privacy protection, really two different ways of going about, well, there's three different ways if we look at data classification. And what you're seeing here is mandatory access control, which is very regimented. Everybody has a level. So if you look at the left column, the general military classification, the lowest classification would be unclassified, and as we move up, it would be considered more sensitive data. And the key with this type of data classification scheme is that individuals and items or articles receive some sort of security level. So for instance, the document that you create on your desktop, you decide that it might have a restricted access level. Only individuals with restricted access level or higher can gain access to it. So not only does the data itself receive a classification, but the users also have to receive a classification. And that's a very strict, very regimented way of going about and determining data classification and data access. Don't see it too often anymore. We have also discretionary access control, which allows the individual user that creates a piece of data or a piece of information to determine what level it should receive and who should have access to it. And today we have what's referred to as role-based access control. So depending on where you work in the organization or what level you're at in the organization determines what you have access to. It's a little bit more flexible and a little bit easier, a little bit easier to manage. Some legal mechanisms that we may look at, and we will look at in this course, to try to look at how regulatory agencies have tried to implement information security across a particular industry. Some laws that you should be familiar with, and by the end of the course you will be intimately familiar with, things like Graham-Leach-Bliley, is a Privacy Act, and HIPAA as it relates to health insurance portability and privacy, and Sarbanes-Oxley, and there's more that we'll talk about, child online protection, and just a bunch of them. And then we can also look at information regulations that we might see within particular industries, so the financial industry and credit card industry and healthcare. And then also we're going to examine particular agencies that have an interest in enforcing information security and privacy regulations on those entities that would fall underneath their jurisdiction, like the FTC and the banks and the Department of Health and Human Services and the Securities and Exchange Commission and Department of Energy, and we go on, and in each state we would see some of these same things as well. So we're going to look at a bunch of different mechanisms that are in place to try to help organizations meet a certain level of security. For an organization to begin the process of determining their level of security and then moving forward to try to improve their security, that one of the key concepts that they have to implement, one of the key programs that they have to implement, is this concept of risk management. And risk management really is taking a good look at your organization, first trying to determine what pieces of information you have, what types of technology you have, what level of importance it is within the organization, and then looking at it in a systematic way, determine which vulnerabilities, or determine the number of vulnerabilities or the types of vulnerabilities, how likely that vulnerability is to cause harm to your organization. If it does cause harm, how much or how great of harm, and because we want to be able to quantify it at some level, and then rank them, recognizing the fact that in information security, there's never going to be enough money, there's never going to be enough resources to secure everything, so we need to try to determine which of those things are most important, and then put some safeguards in place to try to shore up those assets that we think are most vulnerable, and maybe it's your customer information, maybe it's your research and development, maybe it's your financial statements. Each organization is going to do this a little bit differently. But the bottom line is this is a process that's an ongoing process. It's cyclical in nature, and it needs to be perfected over time. And I think your text is going to spend a lot of time talking about it as it relates to some of the regulations, and you're certainly going to get a little bit more of this as we move through some other courses. And this particular text that we're using today divides the typical IT infrastructure up into 7 domains. And if you look at it, the first domain on the left is user domain, and there are certain controls and some concerns that we would have there. Workstation domain, LAN to WAN, the larger WAN domain, and then your broadband internet. And this is just peculiar to this particular organization. It can be divided up in, like the National Institute of Standards and Technology looks at it a little bit more broadly, and there's 27 different domains that we would be concerned about. And then if you look at an organization like the Information Systems Audit and Control Organization, they're gonna break it down even more. So this is just one particular way of looking at it. It's neither great nor is it a poor representation. It just helps us, really think about how can we go about attacking the particular issue, and tries to break it down into smaller chunks to help it a little bit more manageable. The risk management process, again, kind of a unique representation to this textbook, really looks at the different types of ownership, the safeguards that are in place, and then it looks at some vulnerabilities and threats and how they interplay as it relates to a particular asset. This is just, again, one basic representation. The risk assessment process or the risk management process really is about understanding what assets you have, ranking them in some order, determining what vulnerabilities exist, determining if there's a threat related to that vulnerability, if there's some sort of threat agent that will make that vulnerability cause us harm. Do we have the ability to put safeguards in place? And then, what will it look like after we put that safeguard in place? Did we mitigate our exposure there? Or do we need to try to do something else, like transfer that exposure to a third party through the use of insurance, or do we just accept it? The risk management process, this slide makes it look really nice and neat. It's a little bit messier than that, and it is a time-consuming and resource-consuming process to go through, but it's so important that everyone understands that risk management and risk analysis is really the cornerstone of any solid information security plan. And, we take a little bit of a look in Chapter 1 also about, how does information security fall within an organization. And again, this is a representation where the Chief Information Officer, Information Security Officer might report to senior management, and under them they might have the Information Technology Department, or they might be some sort of sistering to the legal department. There's many different ways that the Chief Information Security Officer can fit into an organization. Sometimes they report to the CIO, sometimes they report to directly to the Chief Executive Officer, the Chief Operating Officer. It really depends on where they might fall within any particular organization. Some are a little bit more effective than others, but the bottom line is it has to be right for the corporate culture. We look at information security in the context of different types of operating environments, and here's a representation where information security within the public domain or the government domain is very interested in keeping information confidential, protecting the information. Where in a private corporation, information is an asset that usually is used to generate income, so there might be an interest of keeping it available. So as you can see, if you look at the two, the goals of those two organizations, very different. The public is really concerned about maintaining a high level of confidentiality, so their approach to cybersecurity and information security is going to be a little bit different than that you might expect to see in a private corporation that's really about using the data that they create to make profit. So they're going to be really focused on availability as well as integrity and confidentiality to some extent. And then we got to take a quick look in this course about some of the mechanisms for ensuring information security, and here is where you're really going to focus on the written assignments is going to look at different regulations and how it relates to information security. But the four domains that we will look at are laws and legal duties and legal responsibilities, contractual obligations, this concept of governance, and then voluntary organizations and voluntary compliance with standards are all different ways that we go about looking at securing information security or securing data through the principles of information security. Some of the areas that we are going to focus on and that we really need to pay attention to as it relates to laws and information security are things like theft or data theft or theft of proprietary information in cyberspace or through the use of technology. Some of the transitional crimes like extortion that have moved to an internet-based type of operation. Again, more terrestrial crimes like pedophilia, which has adapted technology to make illegal or illicit materials more widely available to individuals, and has also really changed the way that law enforcement has had to go about investigating these types of crimes. Jurisdictional issues. The internet and the World Wide Web has created a lot of jurisdictional issues as far as trying to determine what particular agency, what particular branch of law enforcement, what particular group of law enforcement is responsible for identifying and investigating the crimes, and then where should they be prosecuted. Again, things that are still being worked on and will continue to be for quite some time. And then, finally, we can look at the use of technology for commerce and creating the ability to electronically sign documents and the legitimacy of that type of activity. So there's lots of things that we can look at and lots of things for us to be concerned about, and all these really tie nicely back to the field of cybersecurity in general. And specifically things like the tools and techniques that we might use to try to ensure that where appropriate we can restrict the ability of an individual and organization to engage in activity that might not necessarily be legal or ethical, and also make sure that the data and the tools are available for organizations who want to use data or want to use information in the internet and the World Wide Web for legitimate reasons, should be able to do so without fear of causing harm to themselves or to others. So again, we want to make sure that we focus on the CIA triad: confidentiality, integrity, availability, recognizing that we're never going to be able to have 100% of all. It's going to be some sort of fine mixture of those three attributes that we're trying to strive for, depending on what the overall mission of the organization is. We want to make sure that in Chapter 1 you come away with some of the understanding of the basic information security concepts, some of the threats that we might see, an understanding a little bit about the risk analysis and mitigation process, how organizations might go about protecting some of their information assets, and then a little bit about the data classification schemes. And then if you move into Chapter 2, we really are looking at some legal issues as it relates to information security, and we really want to focus on, and you're going to spend a lot of time in some of these lab exercises and some of the discussions, and even some of the written assignments about this concept of privacy and some of the legal protections that we might have some misconceptions or misunderstanding about. And really, when you look at Chapter 2, you should be asking yourselves, why is privacy an issue? And how is it different from information security? How is keeping something private different from securing it? And what laws are available for our protection of our privacy? And not just privacy or the fear of intrusion from government agencies, but also protection of our personal privacy from other individuals. And then what are some of the threats that we are beginning to see and some infringements on privacy in this information age? And then Finally, we'll look at some of the principles of privacy protection as it relates to information systems. So what kind of privacy is important to you? Is the concept of keeping your information private? Is it about keeping your communications private? And then, what information or communication should be public? When should you not have that reasonable expectation of privacy when you're using technology? And what are our rights to privacy? What do we understand to be our rights, and how do we go about ensuring that organizations are not somehow trampling on our rights as it relates to the fair use of technology and their services and so forth and so on? So we can say that we have a critical loss of privacy in the internet society, and it's not a loss in the sense that we unknowingly or unwittingly are giving up our privacy rights, but it's more a sense of a loss because we perhaps are not as diligent as we might be when we're using some of the tools and some of the systems that are out there. For instance, Facebook, or when we give our information to a third party, are we aware of how they're going to use that information? Are we aware of the security controls that they might have around those particular pieces of information? And are we aware of, or are we fully certain that they need that information in order to conduct the business that they're engaging in with us? Do they need my social security number in order to conduct this transaction? Do they need my email address in order to conduct this transaction? And if not, do I have the right, or should I have the right, or should I maintain the right to not provide that information to them? And when we look at the loss of privacy, we want to try to look at that in relationship to the liabilities that the companies face in the event that information is somehow lost or compromised. How does that loss of privacy impact me as an individual, or you as an individual, when we engage in communications and commerce through the use of technology? And what are our responsibilities to protect ourselves from our privacy being released? Are we taking advantage of opt-out? Are we, again, minimizing our digital footprint? Are we controlling who has our information and to what extent we give permission to use our information? And these are all the things that we have to begin thinking about from a consumer or a individual privacy perspective, because that will directly impact how the organizations that we work for try to provide controls that make sure that we can address the concerns of the individuals that we're trying to collect that information from. If you work for a bank, do you have a full understanding of the concerns that consumers have releasing information to that financial institution? And if so, have you adequately addressed them through policy, through procedure, through technology to try to turn cybersecurity from a cost center to a competitive advantage? So this is kind of how we look at this loss. A couple of quick questions I think they're asked in your textbook or are hinted at in the book. Is encrypted data safe? And do you understand, and does everyone generally have an understanding that encryption does provide some safeguards, but it does not necessarily ensure that the data itself is safe? Protected access wireless networks are safe. Do we feel comfortable enough to go to McDonald's and use their open Wi-Fi? Is it safe? Is it safe enough for us to use? What are the controls? What are the weaknesses? What are the concerns with that? Do all companies need information security policies? Should they all have one, regardless of size, regardless of the type of data that they collect, regardless of the industry? Do all companies need information security policies? Do all companies need information security plans? And then, should employees have access to everything? I think that you have to think about these questions, and it might be interesting for us to talk about them in the discussion module, whether encrypted data is safe. Do protected access wireless networks are they safe? Does everyone need an information security policy? These are things that we can kick around, and lots of us probably have some very strong opinions, but most of these can be answered in a fairly technical manner, or I'm sorry, not technical, but a legitimate manner, with a little bit of research and a little bit of understanding of some of the concerns. if we look at compare information security to privacy, you can see that they're really very different. Information security is very much concerned with, again, integrity, confidentiality, availability, access control, authentication, authorization, non-repudiation, where privacy is really looking at things like collection limitations. Do we need to collect everything? Do we need to allow those organizations to collect everything? What is the quality of the data? Is it good? What specific purpose are we going to use that data? If we don't need it, should we be collecting it? What are the safeguards that we've put around ensuring that that information stays private and it maintains integrity? Does the consumer or the individual that's providing this information, do they understand that are they willing participants? Are they knowledgeable participants? Or do they know what they're doing? And then obviously accountability, making sure that the organizations that collect the information, the people that use the information, are responsible for any issues resulting from the misuse or loss of control of that particular piece of information. Some of the shared things that information security and privacy have in common is data quality equals integrity equals accuracy. So many of the things that we do from a security perspective will have a positive impact on the quality of data. Authentication is equal to security safeguards. Authenticating an individual, in theory, assuming that all the controls are in place the appropriate way, should ensure that only individuals with the right to know have access to that particular information. Openness equals availability, but I think from a information security perspective, availability with the control of authentication and authorization, and then that's where use limitation and authorization fall into place. That role-based access control, need to know least amount of access required to do their job. That's really from a information security perspective. Information security obviously is a process. Privacy is the outcome of that information security process, assuming that we put all the appropriate controls in place. A quick checklist of some of the privacy protection things that we should see within organizations, and we hope that they're there. You know, an individual or an entity within that organization should be responsible for privacy. It should identify personal information that's being collected. Access discrepancies between privacy laws and policy and regulations should be addressed. Create privacy policies and procedures within an organization. Implement change management plan as it relates to privacy and privacy policies, and then monitor compliance. These are things that organizations are really still struggling with, because this concern about privacy, not necessarily new, but it's taking on its life of its own. It's kind of breaking apart from this concept of information security, and it's causing us to have to rethink the way that we look at ensuring the data that we collect on third parties is maintained in a manner that's consistent with the protections that information so richly deserves. Again, looking at where privacy individual might fall into in an organization, you can see here that a chief privacy officer might be somebody who is separate from the chief information security officer, but at the same level, still reporting to senior management, perhaps filtering through the legal department, but definitely not part of the IT department. And again, that's a little bit different, and it's really going to depend on where that organization chooses to put it. This is just one example. A little bit of an evolution of data protection that we might see as we look at kind of a snapshot of where we were and where we came from. If we look back to early 1900s, late 1800s, everything was punch card. There was no confidentiality, integrity, and availability methods, mostly because access control to that particular machine was how security was implemented. And you also had to be an expert user. You had to understand how the cards worked. You had to understand how the machine worked in order to use it and interpret the results. In the 50s, we saw mainframes, and we saw a little bit of confidentiality, integrity, and availability as it related to, again, maintaining access control. Nobody was going to come in and move a mainframe out and steal the device, but you had to control who had authorization to use the machine, and then, you know, input-output controls were also very important. And then as we move into, you know, the modern era where we have computers being connected together to make networks, and networks are being connected together to make larger networks, and hence the birth of the internet, we have a much different approach to data protection, and this is where we see confidentiality, integrity, availability, utility, authorization, authentication, all these things came into play because now we're connecting multiple computers together. We're also putting everybody that's connected has the same levels of access, so we need to start looking at different levels of authorization. It's just a whole new twist on how we go about protecting information. It's just a phenomenal migration of security over the past really 20 years. Some federal and state privacy laws that we're going to look at specifically: the Freedom of Information Act, the Privacy Act, U.S. Patriot Act, and then there's a variety of state laws. All had some impact, some positive, some maybe not so positive impact on privacy and privacy laws and expectations of privacy in the United States. But we'll touch on these as we move through. All very important, and then all open for debate too, whether they had a positive or negative impact on privacy as it relates to the use of information without restriction. And then, a quick summary. Why is privacy an issue? Well, I think that privacy is an issue because it's something that's kind of inherent in human beings. We have a reasonable expectation of privacy. We recognize that we do like to keep certain things private to ourselves, but today the information is valuable, and the more information that organizations are able to collect, the more power that they have to make meaningful decisions about the future of their company, the future of the product. So it's an important issue. And privacy is very different from security. We talked about that a little bit. Some of the things overlap. Privacy should be a byproduct of security, but not necessarily the only way to reach privacy is through security. Talk a little bit about some privacy laws, and we will talk about them at length in some of the assignments. We see that there's threats to information security, or through threats to privacy in the information age. Specifically, we know that there's an abundant amount of information. Information has value, and we need to be aware of the types of information that we're releasing about ourselves, who's using it, what they're using it for, and who's responsible for it. And then some principles of privacy protection and information security about how we go about the collection of limitations, data quality, purpose and specification, use limitations, security safeguards, openness, individual participation, accountability, all those things that we should be concerned about. Data quality equals integrity, it equals accuracy, so forth and so on. We need to be start thinking about them as it relates to data privacy. And then finally, Chapter 3, really looking at some legal issues in information security. Real quick, we will check out some of the laws that we would see identify basic components of the American legal system. This should be very much a review for most of us. Talk about some of the components of the American legal system. Codes versus common laws, all covered in Chapter 3. Categories of laws, how precedence affects laws. Chapter 3, pretty much an overview of some of the things that most of us should have mastered or should have a good understanding of. But again, anything that you're not real clear on, let's make sure that we talk about it. If we look at components of the American criminal justice system and the American legal system, we have a law enforcement, we have judicial system, and then we have the penal system. And we're really specifically talking about the criminal justice system, because you notice that we're really not talking about the civil liability at this point. Bill of Rights, history lesson, 1789, ratification of the Constitution. 1791 discovered that there were some concepts missing from the earlier documents, so they developed some of the first amendments to the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. And then there's a bunch of different laws in the United States that most of us are familiar with: common law, values and customs, codes, which are written, constitutional law, highest authority, legal precedences, guidance from past cases and past decisions. All these have a big impact on how we interpret the law as it relates to information security. Brief description of privacy rights as it relates to the Bill of Rights, Amendments 1, 3, 4, 5, 9, and 14. But that being said, often there's this interpretation that privacy is overtly stated in the Constitution, and it's not. We're inference. It's inferred through certain things. Privacy from unreasonable search and seizure as it relates to government, but it's not necessarily dealing with private entities. General protections of privacy in Article or Amendment 9. So there's protection against against self-incrimination in the Fifth Amendment. So there's lots of inferences to privacy, but nowhere in the Constitution is it explicitly said that we have the right to be private. And if you look at culturally in the United States, the concept of privacy is relatively a new thing. Not such a big deal during colonial times, not such a big deal during the settlement of the United States, because just the way that we lived, privacy was basically impossible anyway. People lived in shared housing, people lived close together. It wasn't until we perhaps became more urbanized, became a little bit more civilized, that we began to think about our this concept or this theory of right to privacy. So it is still relatively a new thing, but it's interesting to talk about it as it relates to the Constitution, and it's always an interesting discussion to have. So the Bill of Rights, as it relates to the 21st century and how significant it is, increased importance of information security. We recognize the fact that we're collecting a lot of information and that it's of value. It's of value to the organizations that collect it. It's also value to the individuals who wish to steal it. We are definitely in need, I think, of some new laws and laws regulating the use of information and technology. These should be created to protect individual citizens' rights from privacy, but it's a little bit different because we're not just worried about protecting it from government use. We're also trying to protect ourselves from the misuse by other private entities, corporations, and whatnot. And then obviously we need to limit some infringements on the constitutional rights. And incidentally, just yesterday, I believe, the Supreme Court came out with a finding that really is a positive as it relates to privacy, in that now they decided that law enforcement officers need to have a search warrant to search a phone seized as a result, as a result of an arrest. Up until this time, there was some thought that a search warrant wasn't necessarily necessary to allow law enforcement the opportunity to examine a cell phone incident to arrest or so that's a good thing. Again, it's a positive step in that the courts are beginning to recognize that some things need to be included in there. That was just, a real quick touch on the law aspect as far as the criminal justice system and the Constitution. We're going to spend quite a bit of time, like most of the course, talking about, the various laws, regulations as it relates to information security. So we'll get into each of those as we move through the modules. Again, if you have any questions, feel free to post them up there in the discussion module. You can always talk about them in the hallway module discussion forum as well. And I look forward to interacting with you in the discussion. Thanks.